In this video, Jordan Peterson talks about the complexity of life.
Okay, so here's another way of looking at it. The world is extraordinarily complex. Like, it's insanely, ridiculously complex. And part of the complexity is the fact that, and this is a hard thing to grasp, although it's sort of self-evident once you think about it, everything that you see exists at multiple levels of analysis simultaneously, right? And this is sort of like the train metaphor. So, you know, for you to be you, for a person to be a person, there's an incredible number of microstructures that make up that person that have to be functioning in no unpredictable manner whatsoever. You know, so you exist at a quantum level, and we're not going to talk about that because there isn't anything to say about it that's intelligible. You exist at an atomic level and a molecular level, and then the molecules make organs, and then the organs interact to make you, and then you're nested in a family, and then that family's nested in a city, and the city's nested in a state, and the state is nested in an economy, and the economy is nested in a biosphere. And every single one of those levels of analysis, it isn't that it's relevant to you, it's actually that it is you. Now, you only figure that out when something goes wrong, because as long as things aren't going wrong, they're invisible. And now that's an important thing to realize. So one of the things that one of the determining factors with regards to your capacity to regulate your own emotion, including anger and fear, disgust, and a variety of other things we'll talk about, is the fact that a million invisible things are doing exactly what they're supposed to be doing all the time. Now, the problem with that is that at any time any of those things can go wrong. So, and that's the problem of finite mortality in a sense, you know, that you're the sort of being that can be plagued by unexpected events at multiple levels of analysis. And it's by no means obvious which of those levels of analysis is most real. I think they're all equally real. It's also no small feat to pick the level of analysis at which you should be approaching a given problem. People argue about that all the time. You know, when they might say something like, what's the greatest problem facing humanity today? It's like even conceptualizing where the problem is in that entire tree of being is something that you can argue about for forever and not get anywhere. So part of what I want to point out to you by all these examples is that a lot of what human beings are doing in their perceptual and cognitive operations is constraining the complexity of life to limits that enable them to stay alive, but also within limits that enable them to bear staying alive. Both of those at the same time. Because you want to keep existing, obviously, and hypothetically you want to propagate, but also hypothetically you want to do both of those things while not suffering yourself absolutely to death. And so that's a set of constraints. And it's necessary to know how much of the world is invisible to you, because unless you have some understanding of how much of the world is invisible, you can't understand how many things might be going wrong when something goes wrong. And so here's a hint in some sense. If something interferes with the integrity of your categories, all the snakes that are inside those categories come out. And then you have to deal with all those snakes. And that's a big problem. And so you don't like having your categorical systems, the adequacy of your categorical systems challenged in any way. And it's no wonder. And it seems to me that this is particularly relevant with regards to social conflict between different ethnic groups or between groups that have been historically isolated from one another to some degree, because the groups come at the world with different conceptual structures and they're not necessarily isomorphic. Some of the more fundamental assumptions might not be the same from one place to another. And that means the validity of the categories that both of those groups use to organize their existence in the world come under assault when they meet. So, it's a big problem. And you know, you might say, well, why do people engage in conflict all the time? And part of the reason is because there is conflict. Like if you believe one thing and I believe another, and we happen to occupy the same territory, and those beliefs have implications for how we're going to behave, there's going to be conflict. There's going to be conflict. And as far as I can tell, there's a very limited number of ways that that conflict can be resolved. One is I can become a tyrant, or you can, which one of us is a tyrant and one of us is a slave. And that, you know, the logical end point to that is one of us is alive and one of us is dead. And the other possibility is that we can negotiate and see if we can figure out how to cohabit in this territory behaviorally and conceptually simultaneously for a long time. But that's extraordinarily difficult because it means you have to take your concepts apart where they conflict, and then you have to figure out how to put them back together in a manner that actually works. So when you might say, well, you should be tolerant. It's like, yeah, you better be tolerant because you'll never get along with anybody if you're not. But you should be tolerant is no answer to this question, because the question is, well, how tolerant should you be and under what conditions? And believe me, you can be too tolerant. That's easy.